Welcome in. It is so great to have you here for this deep dive.
Absolutely thrilled to be doing this one.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start. I want you to imagine, just for a second,
Just for a second.
yeah, that you are holding an ancient manuscript in your hands. But this isn't just a record of things that have, already happened. It claims to be a map,
Right.
and not a map of geography, but a literal map of the future. Imagine holding a text that asserts it can trace the precise rise and fall of the greatest empires the world has ever seen.
It's wild to think about.
It is. And it details the slow, agonizing moral and physical decay of human society over centuries, and then ultimately describes the exact sequence of events that will lead to the end of the world.
It is a genuinely staggering premise to wrap your mind around. What's fascinating here is the sheer audacious scale of the narrative we're looking at today.
Yeah, the scale is massive.
We are diving into a collection of source materials, specifically excerpts from a very dense, historically rich, and deeply complex theological text regarding Islamic eschatology.
And just to clarify for everyone, when we use a term like eschatology,
Right, we are simply talking about the theology of the end of the world, the final destiny of humanity and the cosmos.
got it.
These specific texts are focused on what are called the prophetic previsions. These are the prophecies attributed to the Prophet Muhammad regarding future trials, massive geopolitical conquests, and the ultimate arrival of the end times.
And our mission for this deep dive is to really get into the weeds of this fascinating timeline. We want to understand not just what the text says is going to happen, but how it structures all of human history into this grand, overarching narrative.
Exactly.
We're talking about severe spiritual tests, massive geopolitical shifts, and this profound underlying sense of ultimate cosmic justice. But before we take that plunge into the timeline, it's probably a good idea to set the stage for how we're going to approach this material.
That is a crucial point, because this raises an important question about our role as we navigate this material.
Right, the ground rules.
Yes. As we dive into a text that is deeply religious, historically charged, and contains very specific sectarian viewpoints and sweeping theological claims, our approach has to be entirely analytical.
Purely analytical.
We are acting entirely as your guides to the literature. We are not here to take sides, to verify the historical accuracy of these prophecies, or to endorse the specific religious or sectarian beliefs the author is arguing for.
Which is so important to remember.
It is. We are exploring this purely as a profound, highly influential piece of historical and religious architecture. We want to unpack what the original source material asserts, because texts like this have fundamentally shaped the worldview of millions of people over centuries.
I love that approach. We are looking at the architecture of belief.
Exactly.
So with that framework in place, let's look at how the timeline actually begins, because it doesn't start with the end of the world. It starts with the immediate aftermath of the prophet's life.
Right, the very next chapter of history.
The text kicks off with some incredibly bold predictions about massive geopolitical shifts. It paints a picture of this rapid, almost unbelievable expansion of early Islam out of the Arabian Peninsula, and it gets highly specific about where they're going to go.
It is incredibly specific, which is part of what makes studying these previsions so gripping. The text notes prophecies regarding the conquest of lands where something called the Kirat is mentioned.
The Quran.
Yeah. Now, to ground this in history, the source identifies this land as Egypt and the territory of the Copts. The Kirat was a specific unit of measurement and weight, a fraction of a dinar, that was culturally and economically ubiquitous in Egypt at the time.
That's amazing.
So the prophecy isn't just a vague, you will conquer lands to the west. It is a highly localized cultural marker.
It's like predicting the conquest of a country by referencing the specific slang they use for their currency.
Precisely. And the text doesn't just stop at Egypt. It details the establishment of brand new garrison cities, specifically naming the future cities of Basra and Kufa. It places the founding of these cities during the era of the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab.
Okay, we have to pause on the mention of Basra for a second, because the prophecy the text provides regarding Basra is wonderfully eerie.
It really is.
The source recounts a warning given to a companion named Anas ibn Malik about this future city. It says that people will establish these new cities, and one of them will be called Basra. The warning tells him that if he ever passes through it or enters it, he needs to explicitly avoid its marshy areas.
Its markets, too.
Yes, its markets and the gates of its rulers. He's told to stick strictly to the outskirts.
And the reason why is fascinating.
Right, because the text predicts that in those central bustling areas, there will be earthquakes, massive sinkholes, and even people being physically transformed or mutated.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how these texts functioned for the people reading and preserving them centuries later. They provided what you might call a moral geography.
A moral geography, I like
Uh,
that.
it wasn't just a military prediction of conquering a territory.
Sure.
It was assigning a spiritual and physical destiny to that land. The downtown areas, the markets, the places of political power and
The
commerce.
places where everyone wants to be.
Exactly. These are the places where moral corruption concentrates. Therefore, according to the text, these are the places where the earth itself will eventually rebel and swallow the inhabitants. It is a terrifying urban legend, but one rooted in divine warning.
That concept of moral geography is fascinating. It's assigning a pulse to the land itself. And that brings us to what might be the most audacious geopolitical claim in the early parts of the source text.
The empires.
Yes, I'm talking about the sheer dismantling of the global superpowers of the era. The text states, and this is a direct quote from the source, "If Caesar perishes, there is no Caesar after him, and if Khosrow perishes, there is no Khosrow after him."
A massive statement.
And then it claims their immense generational treasures will be spent in the way of Allah. How unthinkable was a statement like that in its original context?
It was virtually incomprehensible. To understand the gravity of that statement, you have to look at the world map at that time. You had the Roman Empire, specifically the Byzantine Empire, and the Persian Sassanid Empire.
The big two.
The absolute heavyweights. These were the undisputed, dominant global superpowers. They were the immovable objects of antiquity. They had been locked in massive, world-spanning wars with each other for centuries.
Yeah.
The idea that a relatively small, fragmented group of nomadic and semi-nomadic people emerging from the harsh deserts of the Arabian Peninsula would not just challenge them, but permanently dismantle their ancient institutions.
It sounded like fiction,
Absolute fiction.
but the text presents it not just as a possibility, but as an absolute certainty. So how does the source actually map the fulfillment of that prophecy onto the historical timeline?
The source explains exactly how the events unfolded to fulfill the specific wording of the prophecy. It states that the Caesar of that time, the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, had his power permanently removed from the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula,
Just pushed entirely.
pushed back and restricted entirely to the Roman heartlands. The text explicitly notes this as a great glad tiding for the people of the Levant, the assertion that the oppressive hand of the Roman king would never return to rule over them again. The title of Caesar would never again cast a shadow over those lands.
And what about Khosrow? The Persian Empire seemed even more entrenched, didn't it?
It did. The fate of Khosrow and the Persian Sassanid Empire, as detailed in the source, is even more dramatic. The text chronicles the total annihilation of the Persian state.
Total annihilation.
It notes that the bulk of Khosrow's kingdom was violently stripped away during the time of the second caliph Umar. Then the absolute remainder of it was completely uprooted during the caliphate of his successor, Uthman. The source places the culminating death of the final Persian ruler around the year 32 AH.
I think we should clarify that timeline for you, the listener. Whenever we see AH in these texts, what exactly are we looking at?
Great point. AH stands for Ano Hejre, which refers to the Islamic lunar calendar. It begins counting from the year of the Hijra, the migration of the Prophet and his followers from Mecca to Medina.
Which corresponds to the year 622 in the Common Era, or CE.
Exactly. So when the text mentions the year 32 AH, we are talking about roughly the early 650 CE.
That helps ground it so much. And the text includes this really specific, almost cinematic detail about the prophet praying for Khosrow's kingdom to be torn to pieces.
Yes, the source mentions that Khosrow arrogantly tore up a diplomatic letter sent to him by the prophet. In response, a prophecy was made that Khosrow's empire would be similarly torn into pieces.
Cause and effect.
Pure cause and effect. The source presents the rapid, shocking collapse of this ancient, seemingly invincible Persian empire as the direct, inescapable fulfillment of that specific, localized moment of arrogance.
So you have this period of massive, miraculous expansion. The superpowers are toppled, the wealth is redistributed. But what strikes me is that the text doesn't just paint a picture of endless, unblemished victory.
Not at all.
It introduces this incredibly compelling and honestly quite dark analogy about internal chaos. It uses a specific Arabic word, fitna.
Fitna is a heavy, complex word. It translates roughly to severe tribulation, deep discord, civil strife, or a profound trial of faith. And the text uses a very evocative analogy, stating that this fitna will crash over the people like the violent waves of a dark sea.
This is where the narrative shifts from external geopolitical conquest to internal psychological dread.
Yeah, the tone completely changes here.
The source recounts a deeply symbolic conversation between the Caliph Umar and a companion named Hudhaifa, who was known for keeping the secrets of these future prophecies. Umar is asking him about this specific tribulation that will wave like the sea, and Hudhaifa tells Umar not to worry about it because there is a closed door standing between Umar and that chaotic tribulation.
What's fascinating here is how Umar processes that information.
Yeah.
He is a highly perceptive leader. He doesn't just accept the comfort. He asks the critical, terrifying follow-up question.
He does.
He asks Hudhaifa, will that door be opened or will it be broken?
And Hudhaifa replies, "It will be broken."
And when Umar hears this, the text notes his profound realization of what that means. If a door is merely opened, you can eventually close it again. You can restore the barrier. But if a door is shattered, if it is broken off its hinges,
It can never be closed.
the barrier is gone forever. The text reveals the tragic twist of this metaphor. The door was Umar himself.
Imagine the psychological weight of knowing you are the only thing holding back an ocean of chaos, and that your inevitable death won't just be a passing of the torch, but the breaking of the dam.
It is a profoundly tragic way to view the unfolding of history. According to the text, Umar's assassination, which occurred in the year 23 AH, or 644 CE, wasn't just a political murder. It was a cosmic dam bursting.
Wow.
The source explicitly states that after Umar was killed, the tribulations fell upon the people, civil wars erupted, and discord spread among them like wildfire. He was the physical barrier holding back the chaos of internal division. And once he was shattered, the community would never again know that absolute unified peace.
It sets such a melancholic tone for the rest of the timeline. But the text does provide a very specific, measured timeline for this devolution of governance, right? It doesn't just say things got bad immediately.
No, it is highly structured. The text asserts a prophecy that the period of what it calls the Caliphate of Prophethood, a time of mercy, justice, and rightly guided rule, will last for exactly 30 years after the prophet's passing.
A very specific window.
The source maps this out meticulously. It counts the reigns of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, and it notes that this era culminates exactly at the 30-year mark with the brief 6-month reign of Ali's son, Hassan.
The text seems to place a lot of weight on Hassan's role in this transition.
It does. The text highlights a specific prophecy regarding Hassan, stating that he is a Sayyid, a noble leader, who will bring peace between two massive warring factions of Muslims.
Right.
The source notes that this was historically fulfilled when Hassan made the incredibly difficult decision to step down from the caliphate and hand power over to Muawiyah, an event the text refers to as the Year of the Jama'ah, or the Year of Unity. He sacrificed personal power to stop the bloodshed of the broken door.
But as the overarching narrative reveals, that unity comes at a steep generational cost. Because after those 30 years, the text explicitly says the nature of governance morphs entirely. It stops being a caliphate of mercy and degrades into what the text calls a biting kingship.
A biting kingship is a visceral phrase.
It really is.
It implies a leadership characterized by tyranny, inherited power, force, and corruption. People holding on to power with their teeth, biting down on the wealth and the subjects. The era of the Umayyad dynasty begins, and the door to tribulation, having been broken, allows the storm to fully enter the house.
Which feels like the perfect narrative bridge into the next phase of our deep dive. So with Umar's death shattering that internal peace and this biting kingship taking hold, you would almost think the society would just collapse inward and dissolve.
You would think so, yeah.
But the text actually predicts the exact opposite. It outlines a massive, almost desperate push outward, expanding the frontiers even further and even taking the conflict to the sea.
The shift to naval warfare is a massive development in the text. You have to remember, these were people whose entire history and military doctrine were tied to the desert, the horse, and the camel.
Right.
The ocean was an alien, terrifying expanse. Yet the text details prophecies where people from this community would sail the sea, describing them as looking like kings on thrones.
And there is a beautiful, very human story attached to this naval prophecy involving a woman named Haram bint Milhan. How does the text feature her?
The source notes that when the prophecy about sailing the sea like kings was first articulated, Haram explicitly asked to be among that very first group of naval voyagers, and the text confirms that her request was fulfilled.
That's incredible.
It documents that she participated in the first major naval campaigns to conquer the island of Cyprus. This occurred around the year 27 AH during Uthman's caliphate. And poignantly, the text notes she actually passed away during that specific expedition, fulfilling her role in the prophecy perfectly.
And the source doesn't stop at the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. It details an even more ambitious, second major naval campaign aimed at what it calls the city of Caesar.
Yes, the city of Caesar refers to Constantinople, the heavily fortified, seemingly impenetrable capital of the Byzantine Empire. The text places this campaign during the reign of Muawiyah, roughly around 52 AH, or the late 670s CE. What is truly compelling about the text's description of these military campaigns is the deep underlying religious and spiritual motivation driving the participants.
Give me an example of that. How does the text illustrate that spiritual drive?
The text specifically highlights the story of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. He was an aging, highly revered companion of the Prophet, someone who had been there for the very early days in Medina.
A real veteran.
Exactly. Despite his advanced age, he participated in this grueling siege of Constantinople, and the text details his dying wish. He didn't ask to be sent back home to be buried in familiar soil. He requested that his body be carried as far into enemy territory as physically possible,
Wow.
right up to the massive, imposing walls of Constantinople and buried there under the hooves of the horses.
That is a striking image. It isn't just a military maneuver, it is a profound spiritual statement, pushing the physical frontier of the faith to the absolute limit, planting a flag even in death.
It shows how the prophecies weren't just things people passively waited for. They were directives that people actively organized their lives and deaths around.
But as the community is pushing its borders west towards the impenetrable walls of Constantinople, the text introduces a terrifying, almost alien threat coming from the east. And this is where the language of the prophecies gets incredibly vivid, almost cinematic in its dread.
Very much so.
The source spends a significant amount of time detailing future, catastrophic battles with a group it refers to as the Turks.
To clarify the historical context, scholars and historians map these specific prophecies onto the massive, world-altering invasions of the various Turkic tribes from the steppes, and eventually the devastating Mongol invasions that would shatter the Islamic world centuries later.
Right.
But what is truly striking is how the text describes them physically long before these invasions took place.
The physical descriptions are haunting. Imagine reading this in the 8th or 9th century, trying to picture these invaders. The source repeatedly emphasizes their strange and terrifying appearance to the early Arabs. How does it describe them?
The text describes them as having small eyes, broad and flat faces, and red complexions. It mentions noses that are short and flat. But the most evocative, terrifying phrase used in the source is that their faces look like hammered shields,
Faces like hammered shields.
or layered shields.
It paints a picture of a hardened, impenetrable, deeply formidable, nomadic warrior people.
And it adds details like they wear hair on their feet, referring to the heavy fur boots or shoes necessary for survival in the harsh, freezing climates of the Eurasian steppes. To the people of the sweltering Arabian desert, these descriptions must have sounded like an entirely different species of human being descending upon them.
And the existential dread in the text is palpable because of what it predicts these invaders will actually do. The text describes a time when these warriors will pursue the Muslims relentlessly, driving them all the way back into the Arabian Peninsula, retreating into the deep deserts where the wormwood grows.
Yeah.
It says the invaders will be so overwhelmingly victorious that they will literally tie their horses to the pillars of the Muslims' own sacred mosques.
That image, horses tied to the pillars of the mosques, is the ultimate symbol of desecration and total defeat. And the source doesn't just predict a single battle. It outlines 3 distinct waves or encounters with these Eastern invaders.
3 waves.
It states that in the first wave, anyone who manages to run away and flee will survive. In the second wave, some will survive, but many will perish. And the third wave brings total destruction. Those who remain to fight are completely wiped out.
That level of descriptive dread really captures the sheer terror the Mongol invasions would later inflict when they sacked Baghdad and decimated entire populations. But what I find fascinating is how this prophecy actually shaped military strategy. The text mentions a specific reaction to this prophecy from Caliph Muawiyah.
Yes, this is a rare, fascinating instance where eschatological prophecy dictates direct, real-world military doctrine. The source details an incident where Muawiyah receives a dispatch from one of his frontier commanders. The commander is boasting.
Bragging about a win.
Exactly. He has engaged a group of these Turks, defeated them, and taken immense spoils of war. He expects praise and reward.
But Muawiyah doesn't throw a parade.
Far from it. Muawiyah says, "I will fight until the last man is slain." He says, "I will fight until the last man is slain."
He says, "I will fight until the last man is slain."
Far from it. The text says Muawiyah is furious. He immediately orders that commander never to engage them again under any circumstances without explicit permission. And the reason he gives is tied directly to the prophecy. He quotes the prophet saying, "Leave the Turks alone as long as they leave you."
He understood the assignment. He knew that provoking them, even if you win a small border skirmish, risks awakening a sleeping giant that the prophecy explicitly states will destroy you.
Precisely. He viewed them not as a normal neighboring state to be conquered, but as a prophetic inevitability that should be delayed as long as humanly possible.
While the text focuses so heavily on these terrifying existential threats from the East, it does also chronicle further outward expansion. It mentions campaigns pushing deep into new territories.
It does. The source specifically notes future campaigns into Sind and Hind, which corresponds to the Indian subcontinent. And it's important to note how the text bridges centuries of history here. It references events that occurred hundreds of years after the prophet's life, specifically noting the sweeping military campaigns of Mahmud of Ghazni around the year 400 AH, which is roughly the early 11th century CE.
The text mentions Mahmud of Ghazni smashing idols, right?
Yes, the source describes him destroying the great idol of Somnath and returning from the subcontinent with absolutely untold wealth, jewels, and gold. The text presents this massive historical event not just as political history, but as the direct fulfillment of those early prophecies regarding the eastward spread of the faith into India.
But regardless of how much wealth is brought back from India or how far the borders are pushed into Europe, the text always forces the reader to look back at that broken door Umar left behind, the internal rot. The text contains some incredibly harsh warnings about the destruction of the community coming from within.
The internal strife is a constant drumbeat in the text. It contains severe warnings that the destruction of the community won't just come from foreign invaders with hammered shields. It will come at the hands of boys or foolish, reckless youths from the Quraysh tribe. This is widely understood by scholars of the text to be pointing directly toward the corruption and tyranny of the later Umayyad rulers.
And this internal strife is personified in two very specific, terrifying figures foretold in the source. They are known simply as the liar and the destroyer.
The text identifies both of these figures as originating from the Thaqif tribe. The liar is identified historically as a man named al-Mukhtar. He emerged in the garrison city of Kufa, causing massive sectarian chaos by making false claims of receiving divine revelation and utilizing extreme deception to build a following. He represents theological corruption.
And the destroyer. That title leaves very little to the imagination.
The destroyer is identified in the text's historical mapping as al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. He was a notoriously brutal, uncompromising, and tyrannical governor who served the Umayyad dynasty. The history books record him spilling immense amounts of blood to maintain order, including the blood of very prominent, revered early Muslims.
Just ruthless.
Completely ruthless. If al-Mukhtar was theological ruin, al-Hajjaj was political brutality. Together, they embody the realization of the biting kingship.
So how does the text say this dark era of Umayyad tyranny finally ends? It gives a very specific visual marker to look out for.
The text tells the reader to look to the east, to the region of Khorasan, for the emergence of the Black Banners. In the historical mapping of the source, this represents the massive, bloody Abbasid revolution.
The text actually throws some serious shade at the final Umayyad ruler during this revolution, doesn't it?
It does. The source details how the armies of the Black Banners swept in and utterly overthrew the last Umayyad caliph, a man whom the text delightfully and disparagingly refers to as Marwan the Ass. Yeah, this nickname was due to his immense stubbornness and his association with certain deviant theological factions. The text notes that the Abbasids, starting with a leader known as As-Safa, seized the caliphate around the year 132 AH, or 750 CE.
The arrival of the Black Banners perfectly fulfills the prophecy of a massive, violent shift in geopolitical power. The Umayyads are wiped out. But as we transition into the next phase of our deep dive, we learn a very hard lesson. Changing the government doesn't fix the underlying decay of the society itself.
That is the core tragedy of the text. The political revolutions are just surface waves. The real story is the deep, dark undercurrent pulling society down. And that brings us to the unraveling of the social fabric and the profound concept of the strangers.
The Garaba.
Exactly. If the first part of the text was about the rise and fall of political empires, this section is an intricate, heartbreaking anatomy of moral collapse.
And the text frames this unraveling first and foremost through a theological lens of deep, irreversible division. It asserts a very specific numerical prophecy about how the religious community will fracture.
The text claims that just as the Jewish community historically split into 71 sects, and the Christian community split into 72 sects, the Muslim community will eventually fracture into 73 distinct sects.
Now, it's crucial we look at how the author of the source text interprets this 73 sect fracture, because the text makes a highly specific, exclusionary theological claim here.
Yes, the source material asserts that out of these 73 fragmented sects, 72 are deviants and destined for the fire, and only one single sect is the saved group destined for heaven.
Just one.
Just one. The author identifies this saved group as the Jama'ah, representing the main body that adheres strictly to the original unadulterated path of the prophet and his early companions. The author is writing from a strict Sunni eschatological perspective here, and uses this prophecy to validate their specific theological framework against all other emerging groups.
It's a stark boundary to draw, and because the community fractures so deeply and the culture shifts so dramatically, the text introduces this profoundly melancholic concept. It talks about the Ghuraba, the strangers.
The concept of the Ghuraba is one of the most poignant philosophical notes in the entire manuscript. The prophecy states, Islam began as something strange, and it will return to being strange as it began. So give glad tidings to the strangers.
If we think about how a modern audience might relate to that, it's a brilliant exploration of alienation. Imagine living in a society where the cultural consensus is rapidly abandoning everything you consider sacred or morally foundational. Holding on to those traditional core values doesn't make you feel righteous. It makes you feel deeply isolated.
Yeah, you feel entirely alone.
Right. It makes you look weird, out of touch, or literally strange to the mainstream culture surrounding you.
The psychological utility of this prophecy for the reader is immense. It validates that exact feeling of alienation. The text is essentially telling the reader that the profound loneliness you feel, that sense that you no longer fit into your own society, isn't a sign that you are wrong or crazy. It is a sign that the prophecy is fulfilling itself exactly as foretold. It transforms societal rejection to a badge of divine validation.
And the text doesn't just leave it at a vague sense of alienation. It gives us a highly detailed, frankly dystopian checklist of what this societal decay actually looks like in practice. It outlines an anatomy of moral collapse. For instance, it talks about a total inversion of leadership.
The source predicts a time when the absolute worst, most vile, and lowest people in society will be elevated to become the leaders, the influencers, and the decision-makers of the community. The meritocracy is completely inverted.
And it goes further into the everyday social dynamics. It predicts a time when a person is honored and respected by society, given front row seats, deferred to in conversation, not because they possess any actual virtue, wisdom, or kindness, but only because people are utterly terrified of their evil, their cruelty, or their capacity to ruin lives. Respect becomes entirely synonymous with fear.
The text also describes a heartbreaking upending of traditional family structures. It notes a future time when a man will eagerly and subserviently obey his wife, but show extreme cruelty, disrespect, and disobedience to his own mother.
Everything is backward.
Everything. Or a time when a man will bring his casual friends incredibly close, showering them with loyalty, while actively pushing his own father away into isolation. It portrays a society where the deepest, most foundational bonds of blood and reverence are completely severed and replaced by shallow or transactional relationships.
It even notes a loss of reverence in the spaces that are supposed to be the most sacred. The text predicts that voices will be raised loudly, inappropriately, and argumentatively inside the mosques. The sanctuary becomes just another marketplace of noise and ego.
But the societal decay reaches its absolute nadir when the text introduces the concept of the lifting of knowledge. This is the intellectual collapse of the civilization.
Now, when the text says knowledge is lifted, how does it explain that mechanism? Because it clarifies that God doesn't just magically erase information from the physical pages of books.
Right, the mechanism is much more insidious. The source explains that knowledge is lifted through the physical death of the genuine scholars, the people who actually embody, contextualize, and deeply understand the wisdom.
The people who actually know what they're talking about.
Exactly. As these giants of intellect and piety pass away and are not replaced, a vacuum is created. The text says the public will then turn to ignorant people, elevating them as their new leaders and scholars. These ignorant leaders will be asked complex questions, and they will issue rulings, opinions, and fatwas based on their own flawed logic or desires without any actual grounding in sacred knowledge.
Which is a recipe for disaster.
A complete disaster. Consequently, they go astray themselves, and they confidently lead the entire society astray with them. It is a systemic, catastrophic collapse of intellectual and spiritual authority.
That is terrifying. It's the blind confidently leading the blind toward a cliff. And that brings us to what I think is the most haunting, visceral image in the entire text regarding this loss of knowledge. It's a prophecy about the eventual total fading of the Quran itself.
The concept of civilizational amnesia. The text predicts a time will come when the Quran is literally wiped away overnight. The source says it will be entirely erased from the physical pages of the books, leaving them blank and completely erased from the hearts and memories of the people.
I want you to imagine the sheer existential dread of that scenario. Waking up tomorrow morning and every digital file, every printed page, every memorized verse of the most important foundational document of your entire culture is simply gone. A digital dark age, but for the human soul. You know it existed, but you can't access a single word of it. What does the text say happens to the people left behind in that void?
The source paints a desolate picture. It says all that will remain are very old men and women who simply repeat the phrase La ilaha illa Allah. There is no God but Allah. When they are asked why they say this phrase, they will reply that they don't actually know what prayer is, they don't know what fasting is, they don't know what charity is. They have zero theological context.
Don't at all.
None. They just vaguely remember their ancestors saying this phrase, so they blindly repeat it too.
It is the total loss of the manual for how to be a human being in connection with the divine. Only a tiny, frayed, uncontextualized thread of pure faith is all that saves them from absolute nothingness.
And alongside this profound spiritual poverty, the text predicts extreme, almost cartoonish demographic and economic distortions that shatter the functionality of society.
Let's talk about the demographics first. The numbers the text throws out are staggering.
The text warns of a time when the male population will be drastically decimated, while the female population multiplies. It predicts an extreme ratio where 50 women will be reliant on a single male caretaker.
50 to 1.
50 to 1. Historically, scholars looking at this text have interpreted this as a consequence of immense apocalyptic warfare that slaughters the men, or perhaps massive unexplained societal shifts that drastically alter population balances to the breaking point.
And the economic warnings are just as severe. The text portrays an economy entirely stripped of ethics. It predicts a time of absolute exploitation, stating that the amana, which refers to trusts, deposits, or items given in good faith for safekeeping, will no longer be protected. Instead, they will be viewed as spoils to be aggressively taken and exploited by the one holding them.
Furthermore, it warns that the act of paying the zakat, which is the obligatory spiritually cleansing charity meant to help the poor, will be viewed by the wealthy not as a spiritual duty,
But as burden.
worse than a burden, as an unjust fine, a penalty, or a grievous loss. The text even predicts the overt buying and selling of judicial rulings, where justice is merely a commodity for the highest bidder.
It is a portrait of a society where every single human interaction has become transactional, inherently corrupt, and entirely devoid of any higher principle or fear of divine consequence, which, logically, inevitably, escalates into the next terrifying phase of our deep dive. Because in the overarching worldview of this text, severe moral decay on this scale doesn't just result in bad politics or a weak economy, it triggers cosmic, geological, and divine reactions.
Exactly. The text operates on the principle that the physical earth and the moral state of humanity are deeply intertwined. When humanity becomes entirely corrupt, the earth itself begins to violently reject the behavior of the people living on it.
And the text grounds this cosmic reaction in a highly specific historical visual omen that is absolutely fascinating. It describes what it calls the fire of the Hijaz.
The source details a massive geological event from the year 654 AH, which corresponds roughly to the year 1256 CE. A terrifying, colossal fire erupted from the volcanic tracts, the Herat, located near the city of Medina.
We have to try and visualize what the text is describing here because the scale is hard to comprehend. How does the source depict this eruption?
The description in the source is awe-inspiring and terrifying. It states that the volcanic fire was so vast, so intense, and burned so brightly that its red glow illuminated the night sky for hundreds and hundreds of miles.
Hundreds of miles.
The text specifically notes a geographical marker. It says that people way up north in the city of Busra, which is located in the Levant region of modern-day Syria, could literally see the necks of their camels illuminated in the dead of night by the glow of this fire originating all the way down near Medina.
Imagine stepping out of your tent in Syria in the middle of the night, and the sky to the south is glowing blood red from a fire burning across the vast Arabian desert. For the people living in that era who were steeped in these texts, this wasn't just a fascinating geological anomaly or a distant volcano. It was the precise, undeniable fulfillment of a terrifying prophecy. The text presents this fire as a glaring, indisputable warning sign that the timeline of the end is rapidly accelerating.
And this volcanic fire is framed merely as the prelude. It is the visual warning before the physical punishments begin. The text repeatedly warns of three specific cataclysmic events that will violently strike the community. And crucially, it links these punishments directly to open, celebrated immorality.
It lists a few specific cultural triggers for these punishments, right? Things that become widespread and normalized.
Yes, the source explicitly links the impending doom to a time when things like the widespread drinking of wine, the ubiquitous proliferation of musical instruments, and the employment of singing girls become totally normalized and celebrated by the masses. When the culture embraces what the text views as deep frivolity and intoxication, the physical punishments arrive.
Let's walk through those three punishments because the terminology the text uses is intense. First, it mentions kusk. What does that entail?
Kusk is described in the text as the earth literally opening up and swallowing people, their homes, and their wealth alive. We are talking about sinkholes, but on a massive, apocalyptic, divinely targeted scale. The ground you walk on simply gives way and drags you into the dark.
The second punishment is mask.
Mask refers to physical transformation or grotesque mutation. The text specifically mentions people being physically changed into apes and swine. This is a direct echo of earlier divine punishments mentioned in Scripture regarding past nations who aggressively broke the Sabbath or mocked the prophets. It is the outward physical manifestation of their internal moral ugliness.
And the third is kav.
Kav is the terror from above. It refers to being violently pelted from the sky. This could be interpreted as literal stones raining down, meteor strikes, or incredibly violent, destructive storms that level entire cities.
What's crucial to understand about these three events, the sinkholes, the mutations, the pelting from the sky, is the mechanism the text is asserting. It is making a profound theological argument. These are not random natural disasters. There is no such thing as an act of nature in this worldview. It is pure cause and effect. The moral inversion of society reaches such a toxic tipping point that the physical world is ordered by the divine to step in and aggressively cleanse the corruption.
That is the core philosophy of the text's eschatology. However, this escalating timeline of doom raises a massive, pressing question for anyone reading it. Exactly when is all of this supposed to climax? If we see the signs, when is the actual hour of the end of the world going to strike?
And here is where the text introduces a brilliant, agonizing tension. It explicitly refuses to give the reader a date. It gives you the roadmap, but it blurs out the distance markers.
The source actually goes out of its way to refute mathematical rumors that were circulating among the people. For example, it shoots down the popular idea that the world only had a 500-year limit left, or that any clever scholar could calculate the exact year of the apocalypse using numerology or star charts.
The text mentions a specific sermon the prophet gave regarding this, right?
It does. The text notes that the prophet once stood and gave a continuous sermon that lasted from the dawn prayer all the way until the sunset prayer. In that grueling all-day sermon, the text claims he detailed absolutely everything, every major event, every tribal conflict, every trial that would happen until the end of the world. But crucially, the exact moment of the hour itself was deliberately withheld. The text emphasizes that while the signs, the conditions, and the sequence of events are provided in exhaustive detail, the specific hour remains a secret known absolutely only to God.
But the text does give us a feeling of the timeline. It provides this beautiful, deeply melancholic analogy to help the reader understand where they are in the grand scheme of things.
The analogy is striking. The text compares the entire sweeping lifespan of the world, from its very creation to its ultimate destruction, to a single day. And it says that the time remaining in the world, compared to all the vast ages that have already passed, is like the tiny, fading sliver of sunlight that remains just before the sun dips below the horizon at sunset.
You are living in the twilight of history. You know the dark is coming. You can see the shadows lengthening across the ground. The air is getting colder, but you cannot predict the exact, precise millisecond the sun will finally vanish.
That ambiguity is an incredibly powerful psychological tool for the text to utilize. It enforces a state of constant nervous vigilance. You have all these historical signs, the fall of empires, the fire in the sky, the moral decay, to prove to you that the overarching narrative is true. But the lack of a specific expiration date prevents you from becoming complacent. You can't say, oh, it's 100 years away, I can relax. You must always act morally and spiritually as if that final sliver of sunlight is about to disappear right now.
And according to the text, right before that ultimate darkness falls, right when the society is at its absolute most corrupt and desperate, there is one final, brilliant flash of restoration, which brings us to the grand finale of our deep dive, the climax and the emergence of the Mahdi.
After tracing this long, deeply depressing arc of collapsing empires, terrifying invasions, corrupt rulers, and extreme moral and geological decay, the text introduces the ultimate figure of hope, justice, and divine intervention.
So, based purely on what this specific source text asserts, who exactly is the Mahdi?
The text provides a very explicit, detailed profile. He is a man from the Al-Bayt, which means the family or household of the prophet. Specifically, the source traces his required lineage directly through Fatima, the prophet's daughter, and her elder son Hassan. Furthermore, his name will be identical to the prophet's name, Muhammad ibn Abdullah. The text even goes so far as to give us his physical description, noting he will have a broad, clear forehead and a prominent aquiline nose.
It is fascinating how this source draws a very hard sectarian line right here at the climax. It doesn't just predict a generic, universally agreed upon savior, it actively argues against other theological interpretations.
Yes, the author is writing from a strict Sunni eschatological perspective here and explicitly refutes the Twelver Shia perspective regarding the Mahdi. The text aggressively rejects the belief that the Mahdi is a specific historical figure, Muhammad ibn al-Hassan al-Askari, who went into occultation, essentially hiding in a cave or a subterranean vault in the city of Samarra centuries ago, waiting to emerge at the end of time. The text dismisses this belief outright, harshly labeling it a baseless hallucination and a delusion of the devil.
So the source firmly establishes its own narrative. The Mahdi is not a centuries-old immortal figure hiding in a cave. He is a normal mortal man born into the end times. And the text says something really interesting about his preparation for leadership. It says, God will rectify him in a single night.
That phrase, rectify him in a single night, is crucial. It implies that before that specific night, the Mahdi might not even realize his own grand destiny. He might not be a particularly extraordinary scholar or an ambitious leader. He is an ordinary man until God suddenly, miraculously, grants him the wisdom, the piety, and the profound capability to lead the entire Muslim world in an instant.
And his rise to global power is not described as some calculated multi-year political campaign. It's almost framed as a reluctant destiny that hunts him down. How does the text describe his actual emergence onto the world stage?
The text provides a highly dramatic narrative. It states that following the death of a ruling caliph, there will be a massive, chaotic dispute over the succession. The Mahdi, who wants absolutely no part of this political bloodshed or power grab, will flee from the city of Medina, seeking quiet refuge and anonymity in the holy city of Mecca.
But he cannot escape the prophecy. The text says that the righteous people gathered in Mecca will physically recognize him based on the descriptions. They will literally pull him out of his reluctance and actively force him to accept their pledge of allegiance. And the text is obsessively specific about the geography of this moment. It gives the exact GPS coordinates, essentially. It says this forced pledge happens right between the Rukn, the corner of the Kaaba containing the black stone, and the Maqwa, the station of Abraham, right there in the center of the sacred sanctuary of Mecca.
Now, this sudden declaration of a new, divinely ordained leader in Mecca immediately draws the terrifying ire of the existing corrupt political power structures. The text states that a massive, heavily armed military force is dispatched from Syria with orders to march down to Mecca and entirely crush the Mahdi and his small, newly formed band of followers.
But that army never reaches the gates of Mecca.
No, they don't. The source claims that as this massive army crosses the open desert, specifically an area called Al-Baida, located between Mecca and Medina, the earth will violently open up and simply swallow the entire army whole. Every last soldier, horse, and weapon vanishes into the ground, save for maybe one or two survivors left to tell the terrifying tale.
It is the ultimate, undeniable divine validation, that miraculous, horrifying event, the sudden swallowing of an entire imperial army, is the global signal flare. The text says that when people across the region see or hear that this impossible event has happened, the true believers will know for certain who he is. The text specifically mentions the Abdal, the most righteous hidden saints of Syria, and the Asaib, the dedicated bands of pious people from Iraq. They will abandon their homes and flock to Mecca in droves to pledge their allegiance to him.
With his authority miraculously established and violently protected by the earth itself, the Mahdi ushers in the absolute climax of the text's historical timeline, the Golden Age. The source describes a subsequent reign of ultimate, unprecedented global justice that will last for a specific duration of 7, 8, or 9 years.
And the descriptions of this brief but glorious era are incredible to read. It is a total miraculous reversal of the dystopian decay and starvation we talked about earlier. The earth, which had previously been withholding its rain, cursing its crops, and literally swallowing people, suddenly yields an unprecedented, unimaginable agricultural abundance. The text says the sky freely pours down its rain, the earth joyfully gives up its crops, and humanity experiences a level of pure, unadulterated bliss and harmony they have never known in all of history.
And the concept of wealth becomes entirely post-scarcity. We move past economics entirely. The source describes a scenario where money and precious resources are just piled up in massive heaps in the streets, like uncounted grain after a harvest. When a person comes to the Mahdi and asks for financial help, the Mahdi doesn't count out gold coins or check a ledger to see what they deserve. The text says he simply scoops up as much physical wealth as the person can possibly carry in their garment and hands it over to them without a second thought. It is a period of total, absolute security, divine blessing, and perfect equity. The text summarizes it with a beautiful phrase, stating that under the Mahdi, the earth is filled with justice and fairness, just as it had been filled with tyranny and oppression.
It is the ultimate, profoundly satisfying happy ending to what is otherwise a very dark, grueling, and terrifying story of human history. Which brings us to our summary of the journey we have taken today. We have traced a massive, staggering arc through this text. We started with the shocking, rapid fall of the ancient Persian and Roman empires. We watched the protective door of Umar shatter, unleashing centuries of endless internal strife. We tracked the terrifying invasions of the nomadic warriors from the east and the rise of brutal, cynical, internal tyrants. We walked through the total, heartbreaking moral decay of society, where genuine knowledge is lost, trust is violently broken, and the Quran itself fades into civilizational amnesia. We saw the physical earth react with volcanic fire, grotesque mutations, and apocalyptic sinkholes. And finally, we witnessed the miraculous, dramatic emergence of the Mahdi, restoring perfect justice to a ruined world right before the sun sets on humanity.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, living in the modern world? Why do these texts matter? Because texts like this are not just historical curiosities, and they certainly aren't just fantasy novels. They function as vital, desperately needed moral and psychological blueprints for the civilizations that carefully preserve them and pass them down. They show us exactly how past societies managed to process their deep existential anxieties about rapidly changing times, about rampant political corruption, about the painful loss of sacred tradition, and about the terrifying, unpredictable threat of foreign invasions. When the world felt like it was literally falling apart at the seams, when the Mongols were literally at the gates or a brutal tyrant was sitting on the throne, these prophecies provided a badly needed framework. They looked at the chaos and told people that this terror isn't random, it isn't meaningless, it was foreseen. It is all part of a grand divine plan. And ultimately, they allowed everyday people to cling to the profound, sustaining hope that no matter how incredibly dark the twilight of history gets, ultimate justice will miraculously, inevitably prevail over the chaos.
That is such a powerful way to frame it, the psychology of prophecy. And that leaves me with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. If an entire civilization truly, deeply believes that its complete trajectory, both its inevitable, ugly, moral collapse and its eventual, miraculous salvation, has already been meticulously written down and prophesied, does that absolute certainty make people fatalistic? Doesn't make them passive, just sitting on their hands and waiting for the end to wash over them? Or, paradoxically, does it inspire a fierce, urgent desire to make absolutely sure you are standing on the right side of history, fighting for justice, when that final sliver of sunlight finally disappears? How does absolute, unquestioning certainty about the future change the way you choose to act right now in the present moment? Think about that. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the prophetic previsions. We'll catch you next time. Welcome to the deep dive. We're just thrilled to have you here with us today. For this particular journey, we are opening up a massive stack of classical Hadith literature.
A really massive stack.
Yeah, eschatological source materials, going straight into the deep end of the traditions surrounding the end times. And our mission today is to thoroughly unpack the narrations detailing one of the most enigmatic, terrifying, and frankly bizarre figures in this entire theological framework.
Right.
We are looking at the Dajjal, the false Messiah.
It is a remarkably complex collection of narrations we have in front of us. And I want to set the stage right at the outset for you, our listener.
Yeah.
We are examining these materials as a profound, really a psychological, theological, and sociological blueprint of the ultimate deception. Our objective isn't to take a theological side or to preach a specific doctrine. We are just here to impartially decode exactly what these classical sources say, the specific linguistic and historical context of how they say it, and what this intricate narrative reveals about the universal human susceptibility to, well, to charismatic, highly dangerous leaders.
Okay, let's unpack this because the sheer volume of material is staggering. We are going to map out the entire trajectory of this figure. We'll examine the highly specific, deeply counterintuitive physical descriptions provided in the sources.
Very counterintuitive.
Yeah. We will explore the surreal illusions he supposedly wields, trace the geographical and temporal roadmap of his apocalyptic campaign, and dig into the intense philosophical debates that early scholars had regarding his existence.
And we can't forget the finale.
Right. Finally, we'll break down the epic confrontation and the incredibly rapid, chaotic unraveling of the world that follows.
The best entry point into this material is to look at his physical anatomy, because it immediately subverts every expectation a person might have about an apocalyptic deceiver.
Yeah.
When we think of an antichrist archetype, the modern mind naturally gravitates toward a figure of overwhelming majesty, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Someone beautiful, towering, and inherently commanding.
Exactly. You would assume a being claiming to be the supreme creator of the universe would look the part. You'd picture a flawless, radiant entity that simply demands worship by its mere presence in a room.
Right, a literal godlike presence.
But when you actually read these specific narrations, they present a bizarre paradox. The compilers of these traditions highlight an incredibly specific array of physical flaws. According to the accounts, he is a remarkably short man. The Arabic term used is ahaj,
Yes.
which classical commentators translate as being severely pigeon-toed or bow-legged. It gives him an awkward waddling gait.
It is a deliberate emphasis on physical frailty and imperfection. And the accounts go much further into his unsettling appearance. His hair is described as coarse and tightly curled, but the analogies used in the source material are visceral.
They really are.
Some narrations compare his hair to twisting tree branches, while others say it resembles a mass of writhing pythons.
Pythons. I mean, just picture that.
Yeah. Furthermore, his complexion is described with the term azar-hijan, denoting a very pale, intensely stark white or reddish-white skin tone, which in the context of 7th century Arabia would have been visually jarring.
But hold on, let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Pay for it.
If he looks this ridiculous, a short, bow-legged guy with python-like hair, how is this the ultimate test for humanity? It sounds more like a caricature than a cosmic threat. How could anyone possibly look at this deeply flawed human and think, yes, this is the Lord of the universe?
What's fascinating here is that is precisely the theological tension the source material is highlighting. The cognitive dissonance is the point.
A point.
Yes. The narrative suggests that his physical flaws are a deliberate, built-in mechanism to test the intellectual and spiritual integrity of humanity. The compilers are framing a scenario where this entity wields absolute, undeniable material power. He controls the weather, he controls the food supply.
It's everything you need to survive.
Everything.
Mm.
Yet he is trapped in this deeply flawed, pathetic physical vessel. The test is whether human beings will abandon their basic logical faculties and worship a deformed tyrant simply because he holds the keys to their material survival.
That makes the most prominent physical feature mentioned in these texts even more crucial. Every single narration emphasizes his eyes. The Dajjal is profoundly, noticeably blind in one eye.
Right.
But what struck me in the source material is how vividly and differently this defect is described across various accounts. Sometimes the right eye is described as protruding out of his skull, looking like a floating grape.
Yes, the floating grape imagery is meant to convey something swollen and lacking light, but other narrations provide a different, equally disturbing visual. They describe the defective eye, sometimes the left, by the way, as being covered by a thick, opaque piece of flesh, Or they use the unforgettable comparison of it looking like spit on a plastered wall.
Spit on a plastered wall. That is such a gritty, visceral descriptor.
It really
It
is.
implies something entirely dead and unnatural, and the sources contrast this by noting that his other functioning eye shines with this brilliant, piercing light like a radiant star. So you are looking at a face of profound, disturbing asymmetry.
A literal face of contradictions.
Right. But the physical warning signs go one massive step further. A fascinating detail in these accounts is the claim that he comes with a literal, visible warning label. The narrations state that written directly between his eyes are the Arabic letters KFR, spelling out kafir,
Which translates to disbeliever, infidel, or one who conceals the truth.
and the classical commentators provide a vital layer of context regarding this mark. This isn't just a physical tattoo or a birthmark in the traditional sense.
No, the traditions explicitly state that every true believer will be able to read this word, regardless of whether they are highly literate scholars or completely illiterate peasants.
So it's not a matter of reading Arabic script. It's almost like a spiritual synesthesia. If your internal moral compass is calibrated correctly, you perceive the reality of his deception, even if you've never read a single book in your life.
Exactly.
But if you've compromised your principles, you could be the most credentialed intellectual on earth and you'll just see a blank forehead.
That is a brilliant synthesis. The material is making a radical claim about the nature of discernment. It posits that in times of ultimate apocalyptic crisis, true discernment does not stem from formal education or analytical prowess. It comes from an internal state of spiritual clarity. The mark is a cosmic failsafe. It levels the playing field, ensuring that the illiterate nomad has the exact same capacity to recognize ultimate falsehood as the greatest theologian.
It's an internal capta that you can only pass if you have that moral awareness intact. And this ties right into the massive theological irony the prophet presents to his followers in these accounts. He gives them a brutally simple, logical counterargument against the Dajjal's claims.
Right, the ultimate logic check.
He literally says, "Your Lord is not one-eyed." It is such a pragmatic piece of advice. The Dajjal cannot even fix his own glaring physical defects. He can't heal his own eye or fix his own bow-legged walk, yet he demands to be worshipped as a flawless, omnipotent deity.
The material uses this physical reality as an unshakable anchor for the believer's mind. No matter what incredible reality-bending illusions he conjures, the instruction is to look at his fundamental physical reality.
Just look at the guy.
Yeah, just look at him. His claim to supreme divinity is instantly, mathematically nullified by his unfixable human limitations. It is a timeless warning about looking past the charismatic, terrifying presentation of authoritarian figures to see the pathetic, flawed reality underneath.
So if his appearance is this jarring and obvious, it begs the question of where a figure like this even comes from. Who is he before he steps onto the global stage? When you dig into the origins and the aliases within these texts, you uncover this incredibly strange, almost psychological thriller aspect of the source material.
The Ibn Sayyad narrative.
Yes, there is an entire sub-narrative dedicated to a young boy in the city of Medina named Ibn Sayyad, sometimes called Abu Yusuf.
The accounts surrounding Ibn Sayyad are some of the most complex and debated within the classical eschatological literature. The narrations describe him as a deeply strange youth living among the early Muslim community.
Just a local kid, really.
A local kid. But he muttered unintelligibly to himself. He exhibited bizarre, almost clairvoyant behaviors, and he made claims that mimic classical prophetic tropes. For instance, claiming that while his physical eyes slept, his heart remained entirely awake and aware.
And the sources show the prophet actively engaging in counterintelligence against this boy. It's a fascinating dynamic. You have prominent companions of the prophet who are absolutely, unequivocally convinced that this boy is the apocalyptic Dajjal. They are swearing oaths to that effect.
Which shows the level of anxiety at the time.
Oh, absolutely. There's this incredibly tense encounter detailed in the texts where the prophet physically sneaks through a date palm grove, hiding behind the trunks, trying to secretly listen to Ibn Sayyad's muttering to figure out what he actually is.
Just spying on him.
Literally spying. Before the boy's mother spots him and blows his cover, she shouts something like, "Hey, here he is."
It is a remarkable scene of human curiosity and caution. But the theological resolution of the Ibn Sayyad narrative is deeply nuanced. While the companions were ready to execute him, the prophet restrains them.
Right.
The ultimate consensus of the source material suggests that Ibn Sayyad was an archetype. He was a lesser deceiver, a minor Dajjal, but not the final apocalyptic figure.
Right, the narrations actually state that there will be roughly 30 of these lesser liars, or dajjals, who emerge throughout history before the final one arrives.
Exactly. The inclusion of the Ibn Sayyad story serves a distinct sociological purpose in the literature. It establishes a precedent for how deeply the anxiety of deception permeated the early community. It also provides a framework for how to scrutinize claims of the supernatural.
Like hiding behind the palm trees.
Yes, with extreme caution, empirical observation, and a refusal to rush to apocalyptic conclusions.
So if Ibn Sayyad isn't the final Dajjal, where does the actual apocalyptic figure originate? The eschatological blueprint lays out a very specific geographic and temporal roadmap. The accounts explicitly state he will emerge from the east.
The classic direction of the unknown.
They pinpoint a Jewish neighborhood in the city of Isfahan, which is in modern-day Iran, or the broader ancient region of Khorasan. And the timing is intimately tied to global conflict. The texts note he emerges following a massive apocalyptic conventional war and the subsequent Muslim conquest of Constantinople.
The geography here is symbolic of the unknown, or the periphery, in the classical Arabic worldview.
Yeah,
The East, specifically Khorasan, was often viewed as the frontier from which massive destabilizing forces emerged.
it's the edge of the map.
Exactly. But what is far more analytically rich than his geographic origin is the detailed demographic breakdown of who actually follows him. The source material doesn't just say many people follow him, it gives a highly specific sociological census of his army.
And it is a incredibly varied coalition. The narrations specify that his vanguard will consist of 70,000 Jews from Isfahan wearing what the texts call sijan, which are described as heavy green mantles or tailasans. Then he is followed by massive groups of people described as having faces like hammered shields.
Let's pause on that phrase, faces like hammered shields. This is a highly specific visual descriptor.
It really paints a picture.
It does. Classical commentators evaluating these texts centuries later almost universally interpreted this as a reference to the Turkic or Tatar tribes originating from the Central Asian steppes. The hammered shield analogy refers to faces that are broad, flat, with prominent cheekbones and perhaps heavily layered with fat to protect against the cold steppe winds.
Beyond these specific ethnic or regional groups, the narrations emphasize two other major demographics: Bedouins and a disproportionately high number of women. When I first read that, it felt like an incredibly random assortment of people. But when you look at the underlying sociology of these groups and the historical context of the text, a terrifying pattern emerges. Why these specific groups?
Well, if we conduct a sociological analysis of the text, we see a profound commentary on vulnerability and marginalization. Consider the Bedouins. The narrations establish that the Dajjal emerges during a period of catastrophic global famine and drought. A Bedouin's entire livelihood, their very survival, is entirely dependent on their livestock and the land.
Right, if it doesn't rain, they die.
Exactly. The texts describe the Dajjal approaching these desperate nomads and offering to physically resurrect their dead camels and sheep, or to make the barren earth instantly bloom, provided they worship him.
He weaponizes their absolute desperation. He isn't walking up to a wealthy merchant in a secure city. He is going out to the people who are starving to death in the desert.
Precisely. He targets those who lack material security. As for the other groups, including the heavy emphasis on women in the strict patriarchal societies of the classical era, the subtext is about targeting the disenfranchised. He recruits those who are historically marginalized, those who have the least stake in the orthodox power structures of the time, and those who are emotionally or economically vulnerable.
It is the exact blueprint of modern cult dynamics and extremist radicalization. You don't build a massive fanatical movement by recruiting people who are content, financially secure, and deeply integrated into society. You go to the fringes.
You find the broken.
You find the people the system has failed, the people who are desperate, and you offer them immediate, tangible salvation. If you are a parent watching your children starve, and a man conjures a literal mountain of food, the theological debate about his single eye or his bow-legged walk becomes utterly irrelevant. You just want your kids to eat.
That is the terror of the narrative. The material is warning that ideological or spiritual deception rarely operates in a vacuum of purely intellectual debate. It is almost always paired with extreme material lever.
It's coercion.
Absolutely. The followers of the Dajjal are not initially depicted as inherently evil, cackling villains. They are depicted as broken, desperate humans who are easily manipulated by an entity that has established a total monopoly on basic survival resources.
Which brings us to the mechanics of that manipulation. We need to explore the surreal illusions he supposedly wields, because this is where the texts transition from political thriller into cosmic horror. The narrations describe the Dajjal traveling the earth, accompanied by literal, moving, fake utopias. The accounts say he brings with him a mountain of hot, steaming meat and broth, a mountain of lush, green gardens, and a river of flowing water.
The sheer scale of the illusion is designed to overwhelm the human senses. Imagine a world that has been starved of rain for 3 years, and this entity rolls across the horizon, bringing a moving ecosystem of abundance.
It would be mind-blowing.
But the core lesson in this section of the source material is the concept of reality inversion. The most famous narration regarding his illusions states that he brings with him two rivers, or two distinct valleys. To the naked human eye, one valley appears as a blazing, terrifying fire, and the other appears as cool, pristine white water.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The prophet's instruction to his followers facing this scenario is completely counterintuitive to every human survival instinct. The text instructs the believer that if they are caught in this situation, they must close their eyes, lower their head, and voluntarily choose to plunge into the river of blazing fire.
Plunge right in.
Right. Why? Because the narrations state that the Dajjal's fire is actually cool, sweet water, and his cool, inviting water is actually a punishing, destructive fire.
It is a breathtaking metaphor for ultimate deception. The source material is arguing that in the absolute height of the eschatological age, your physical senses, your eyes, your survival instincts will actively lie to you.
Your own brain betrays you.
It does. What appears to be societal progress, absolute safety, or material nourishment, the cool water, is actually the path to spiritual and moral annihilation. And what appears to be immense hardship, social exclusion, or physical danger, the fire, is actually the only path to salvation and truth.
The specific instruction to close your eyes before jumping into the fire is so profound. It implies that you cannot outthink the illusion while looking at it. You have to literally shut off your immediate sensory reaction to his propaganda and rely entirely on your deeper, pre-established intellectual and spiritual grounding. You have to act on principle, not perception.
Shutting off the physical senses to perceive the objective truth is a recurring theme in classical mysticism, and here it is weaponized as a survival tactic. But the manipulation that Dajjal employs goes far beyond just food and water.
Yeah, the deep fakes.
Yes. The source material describes what we can only analyze as the ancient equivalent of deepfakes and AI voice cloning. The Dajjal has the terrifying ability to seemingly resurrect the dead to manipulate the living.
There is a scenario detailed in the text that is just heartbreaking. The Dajjal approaches a man and asks him, "If I resurrect your dead father and your brother, will you testify that I am your Lord?" The grieving man says yes.
Of course he does.
The accounts then state that the Dajjal utilizes devils, or jinn, who perfectly shape-shift and impersonate the specific physical forms, the facial tics, and the exact voices of the man's deceased relatives. These impersonations approach the man and say, "Oh, my son, follow him, for he is your Lord."
For a modern audience, this is arguably the most chilling aspect of the entire narrative. We are currently living through an era characterized by profound anxiety over the erosion of objective truth. We are grappling with deep fakes, sophisticated algorithmic manipulation, and technology that can perfectly recreate the voice of a loved one.
We're seeing it right now.
We are. Imagine an entity that has access to your deepest grief, knows exactly who you mourn, flawlessly recreates them, and uses your own devastating emotional attachments to shatter your perception of reality. The classical text is tapping into the weaponization of human emotion against human reason.
It's pure emotional warfare, and the sheer scale of these apparent miracles actually sparked a massive, highly technical philosophical debate among the early Islamic scholars, which the historical context of these texts highlights. The rationalist Mutazilite scholars, specifically a prominent thinker named Abu Ali al-Juba.
Al-Juba, yes.
He vehemently argued that these miracles could not possibly be real, objective, physical events. Al-Jubai argued they had to be mere optical illusions or sleight of hand.
Al-Jubai's argument was grounded in a strict epistemological defense of prophethood. He posited a very logical dilemma. If God allows a confirmed liar to perform actual, reality-altering miracles like resurrecting the dead or making it rain, then it becomes mathematically impossible for humanity to distinguish between the validating miracles of a true prophet and the dark magic of a deceiver.
That makes total sense.
Al-Jubai argued that God, being just, would never allow that level of epistemological confusion.
But the Orthodox scholars compiling these narrations forcefully push back against al-Jubai's rationalism. The mainstream theological consensus derived from the text insists that these are real physical events. The fire is real, the water is real, the famine is real.
Right.
It is a genuine, brutal trial of faith permitted by God. But that raises a massive question. If I'm a starving nomad and a guy literally revives my dead parents in front of me, how am I supposed to rationalize that? Isn't Al-Jubai right? Isn't that an impossibly unfair test of faith?
That is exactly where the Orthodox scholars bring the argument full circle, right back to the very first point we discussed,
Yeah.
his physical anatomy. The traditionalists argue that the confusion Al-Jubai feared is entirely neutralized by the Dajjal's claim.
Okay, unpack that.
A true prophet comes with miracles and says, I am a humble human messenger. Look at the signs God has given me to prove my message. The Dajjal performs miracles but says, I am the supreme creator of the universe.
Ah, so the flaw is the anchor. Because the Dajjal is a physically deformed, blind in one eye, bow-legged human being, his claim to being the flawless supreme creator is instantly, objectively ridiculous to anyone exercising basic logic.
Exactly. The Orthodox argument is that God allows him to have these terrifying, reality-altering physical powers, specifically because his very physical appearance acts as an undeniable contradiction to his message. The test isn't whether you can figure out how the magic trick of resurrecting your parents works.
You don't have to debunk the magic.
You don't. The test is whether you will abandon your fundamental axiomatic logic that the creator of the universe isn't a one-eyed man who waddles when he walks, just because you were offered a piece of bread or a simulation of your lost father.
That is a fascinating resolution to the debate. The physical flaw is the necessary counterbalance that allows the miracles to exist without breaking the foundational rules of the universe. So amidst all this global deception, starvation, and compliance, the source material zooms in on one specific, highly localized act of defiance. We see the emergence of a hero of the resistance, and the texts lay out a very specific geography of safety.
The narrative of the young believer from Medina is framed in the texts as the absolute pinnacle of human defiance against tyranny.
The ultimate standoff.
Yes, the Dajjal is the absolute zenith of his geopolitical and supernatural power, surrounded by his massive army demanding global submission. Out of this terrified, compliant crowd, a young man steps forward, walks right up to the Dajjal, and tells him to his face, I bear witness that you are the Dajjal, the liar that the messenger of God warned us about.
The Dajjal's response to this truth-telling is incredibly brutal. According to the narrations, he commands his guards to seize the young man. The Dajjal then takes a saw, or in some accounts, a sword, and literally slices this young believer completely in two, from his head down through his legs.
It's horrifying.
To prove his absolute dominance over life and death to the watching crowd, the Dajjal physically walks between the two severed halves of the man's body. Then he commands the body to rise. The young man is miraculously reassembled and resurrected, completely whole again. The Dajjal looks at him, expecting the psychological trauma of death to have broken him, and asks, Now do you believe in me?
And the young man's response is an incredible display of psychological and spiritual resilience. He looks at the entity that just murdered and resurrected him and says, I have only increased in my certainty that you are the liar.
I love that.
The ultimate display of authoritarian power, the control over life and death itself, entirely fails to break the man's internal conviction.
And what happens next is visually stunning. The Dajjal, absolutely furious that he cannot break this one man's mind, lunges forward to slaughter him a second time. But the narrations state that God intervenes directly. From the young man's collarbone up to his head, his neck is transformed into solid copper.
Solid copper.
The Dajjal's blades and weapons simply bounce off. He becomes entirely immune to the tyrant's violence. The accounts describe this young man as achieving the absolute highest status of martyrdom in the eyes of God.
The imagery of the copper neck is a profound metaphor. Copper is unyielding. It doesn't rust. It reflects light. It represents literal, unbending defiance. The physical world can no longer harm the person whose spiritual conviction is absolute. But while this one extraordinary individual is fighting back and surviving via divine intervention, we have to consider what the rest of the surviving population is doing.
Right, because the material outlines horrific apocalyptic conditions leading up to the showdown. The narrations detail a grueling 3-year period of escalating global drought before the Dajjal even appears.
Pre-game, basically.
A terrible pregame. The accounts say that in the first year, the heavens withhold 1/3 of global rainfall, and the earth withholds 1/3 of its crops. The second year, it's 2/3. By the third year, the heavens withhold all rain, and the earth produces absolutely nothing. Every hooved animal on earth dies. It is a total ecological collapse. So naturally, the companions of the prophet ask a deeply pragmatic question. How will the believer survive without any food?
The answer provided in the source material is deeply metaphorical, and it speaks to the concept of spiritual calories. The prophet replies that their food will be tasbih and takbir, which refers to the vocal praising and glorifying of God. Now, classical scholars diverge on how to interpret this.
How so?
Some take a highly literal approach, suggesting that in the end times, God will biologically alter human physiology so that spiritual devotion literally acts as physical sustenance, preventing starvation.
But there is a much deeper sociological way to analyze that, isn't there?
Absolutely. On a deeper analytical level, this represents how communal resilience and spiritual nourishment must replace physical sustenance in times of ultimate crisis. When supply chains collapse, when material resources are completely monopolized by a tyrant, it is your internal principles, your discipline, and your spiritual fortitude that keep you from surrendering.
The Tasbih becomes the psychological armor.
Yes, it prevents you from trading your soul for a loaf of the Dajjal's bread.
That makes profound sense. It's about what sustains your humanity when your biology is screaming for you to submit. But alongside the spiritual resilience, the texts also map out literal geographical safe havens. The accounts explicitly declare that the sacred cities of Mecca and Medina are entirely impenetrable to the Dajjal. He cannot enter them.
They're locked down.
Right. The texts describe angels standing guard at every mountain pass and road leading into these cities holding drawn swords. The absolute closest he can get to Medina is a barren salt flat just outside the city limits, an area historically known as the Jurf.
And his encampment at the Jurf triggers a fascinating mechanism of sociological purification for the city of Medina. The narrations state that while the Dajjal is camped out on the salt flat, unable to enter, the city of Medina will be struck by 3 massive, distinct earthquakes. But it is crucial to note that these earthquakes are not designed to destroy the city's infrastructure.
Right, they serve a highly specific, targeted function.
They do.
The accounts say these earthquakes are designed to violently expel the hypocrites. Anyone currently living in Medina whose faith is fragile, who is secretly harboring disbelief, or who is purely motivated by material comfort will be absolutely terrified by the seismic shaking. They will flee the city in panic, running straight out into the arms of the Dajjal, waiting on the salt flat.
Sorting out the weak.
Exactly. The source material uses this brilliant analogy, comparing the city of Medina to a blacksmith's bellows that forcefully blows away the impurities in the dross, leaving only the pure, tested iron behind. The earthquakes force the ultimate polarization of society.
It accelerates the sorting of humanity. In the end times, the gray area of hypocrisy is entirely eliminated. You are either the pure iron that withstands the shaking, or you are the dross that runs to the deceiver. But the narrations also offer a very specific protocol for the vast majority of believers who are not fortunate enough to be locked inside these 2 protected cities. And it's an instruction that highlights the sheer terrifying danger of the Dajjal's psychological manipulation.
The accounts provide a spiritual defense mechanism, which is memorizing the first, or in some narrations, the last 10 verses of a specific chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf, which translates to the cave. But beyond reciting verses, the behavioral instruction is what I found so compelling. The narrations explicitly command, if you hear that the Dajjal is approaching your area, run away from him. Flee to the mountains. Hide in the valleys.
Yes, the instruction is unambiguous. Flee. It specifically warns that a man will confidently go out to face the Dajjal, genuinely believing his faith and his intellect are strong enough to withstand the deception, but he will end up submitting to him and following him.
Why? If his faith is strong.
Because the shubuhat, the specific arguments, the weaponized doubts, and the manipulations the Dajjal presents are simply too powerful for the human mind to process in real time.
It is a profound warning against intellectual arrogance. The material is essentially saying, do not consume the tyrant's toxic propaganda under the arrogant assumption that you are immune to it. You aren't. The safest, most logical way to survive the ultimate master of manipulation is to categorically refuse to engage with him. You don't debate him, you retreat to the cave.
Which perfectly ties into the naming of Surah Al-Kahf, the cave. The chapter tells the story of youths who fled a tyrannical society and hid in a cave to preserve their integrity. The eschatological instruction is literalizing that metaphor. When the system is entirely corrupted by the ultimate deceiver, the only victory is absolute withdrawal.
We have to shift our focus now to the temporal mechanics of this event because the timeline of the Dajjal's reign is completely warped. We are entering into a discussion on time distortion and the massive theological mystery surrounding his very identity.
The concept of time in these eschatological narrations breaks down entirely. The texts are very specific. They state that the Dajjal will remain on Earth for a period of exactly 40 days. However, the phenomenological experience of these days is heavily distorted.
It's not a normal 40 days.
No. The narrations state that his first day on Earth will be like a year in length. The second day will feel like a month. The third day will be like a week. And the remaining 37 days will pass like normal human days.
If you calculate that mathematically, his total reign on Earth equates to roughly 1 year and 2.5 months of actual real-world time. But I want to sit with the psychological terror of that first day, a single day that lasts for an entire year. The sun literally does not set.
The exhaustion would be incredible.
Imagine the severe disruption to human circadian rhythms, the fatigue, the agricultural devastation, the sheer disorientation. The companions of the prophet, ever pragmatic, immediately asked how they were supposed to calculate their 5 daily prayers during a day that lasts a year.
The fact that they asked about their prayer schedules amidst a cosmic horror event tells you everything you need to know about the resilience of the early community. But analytically, this distortion of time reflects the cosmic significance of the Dajjal's emergence. The entire fabric of reality, the laws of celestial physics, the predictable passage of time is actively fraying. It underscores the ultimate chaos and the complete inversion of the natural order that this figure represents.
But looking at all of this mind-bending detail, the highly specific physical flaws, the moving mountains of bread, the deepfake resurrections, the relativistic distortion of time, it raises an absolutely massive theological question. And it's a question that the classical scholars who compiled these texts tackled head-on.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most critical epistemological question in the entire study of Islamic eschatology. If this figure, the Dajjal, is repeatedly described by the prophet as the single greatest trial and tribulation for humanity, from the creation of Adam to the end of time, why isn't his name explicitly written anywhere in the Quran?
Yeah.
Why is the primary infallible holy text completely silent on his specific name, leaving these granular, terrifying details to be warned about only in the supplementary hadith literature?
It seems like a glaring, almost negligent omission. If he's the ultimate boss fight of humanity, you'd think he'd get a chapter warning about him. But the classical commentators provide 3 distinct, deeply philosophical answers to explain this apparent absence. Let's really dig into them. The first argument the scholars pose is the concept of implicit mention.
Yes, the first argument suggests that he actually is in the Quran, but veiled. Scholars point to a specific verse in Surah Al-An'am that states, "The day that some of the signs of your Lord do come, no soul will benefit from its faith as long as it had not believed before."
So signs covers it.
Exactly. Many classical commentators argue that the signs referenced here implicitly include the emergence of the Dajjal, the rising of the sun from the west, and the beast of the earth. It's a categorical inclusion rather than a specific naming.
The second argument is a bit more academic, resting on the linguistic and structural traditions of classical Arabic rhetoric. The scholars point out that the Quran explicitly and repeatedly details the descent of Jesus, the son of Mary, who is given the majestic title of Al-Masih, the Messiah of guidance. In classical Arabic literary structure, explicitly mentioning one extreme inherently implies the existence of its direct opposite.
By naming and elevating the true Messiah who descends to bring absolute guidance and truth, the structure of the text inherently implies the existence of the false Messiah Al-Masih ad-Dajjal, who emerges to bring ultimate misguidance. It is an argument from duality. But the third argument is by far the most analytically rich and psychologically fascinating.
I completely agree. The third answer the scholars put forward is that the Dajjal is omitted from the Quran due to utter divine contempt.
The contempt argument is incredibly powerful. The scholars argue that the Dajjal is simply too pathetic, too despicable to warrant a direct, explicit mention by God in the eternal divine revelation. Think about the sheer absurdity of his claim. Here is a weak, physically deformed, bow-legged, blind human being who cannot even summon the power to heal the flesh of his own face, yet he has the audacity to stand before humanity and demand to be worshipped as the flawless, supreme creator of the universe.
The scholars suggest that this claim is so profoundly arrogant and so objectively embarrassingly false that the divine text treats him with utter disdain. It refuses to validate his existence or his ego by immortalizing his name in the Quran. It delegates the granular logistical warnings to the human messengers. It's the ultimate divine dismissal.
To contextualize this, The classical scholars often compare the Dajjal to the Pharaoh of the Exodus. They point out that Pharaoh also claims supreme divinity, saying, "I am your most exalted Lord," and Pharaoh is explicitly named repeatedly in the Quran. So why name Pharaoh and ignore the Dajjal?
Good question.
The scholars argue that Pharaoh's trial was in the past. His falsehood had already been historically proven, his empire crushed, and his body drowned. He could be named as a completed historical lesson.
But the Dajjal is a future, ongoing test of active faith. To name him explicitly in the eternal text would be to grant him an undue, terrifying status. He is treated not as a rival god, but as a pathetic, temporary fraud not worthy of the divine ink.
It also reinforces the core thesis we discussed earlier. The test of the Dajjal is deeply intellectual and spiritual. God provides the overarching principles of truth, justice, and monotheism in the main text. It is entirely up to the individual human intellect to apply those foundational principles to the specific chaotic realities they face on the ground. If you understand the Quran, you don't need the Dajjal's name spelled out to know he is a liar.
That is a profound way to look at the theology of omission. But eventually, the theological debates have to end because the timeline runs out. We are moving into the epic finale of this narrative and the descent of Jesus. The scene the narrations set for this climax is unbelievably bleak. The human resistance has been utterly crushed globally.
The remnant of the Muslim believers are depicted as being heavily besieged, cornered, and starving. They've been pushed all the way back by the Dajjal's forces to the mountains of the Levant, specifically taking refuge at a strategic hill called Afik near the Jordan Valley.
It's the last stand.
It is. The accounts describe a state of desperation so profound, a siege so suffocating, that the believers are resorting to burning their own bowstrings and eating them just to survive another day. The Dajjal is moving in for the final annihilating blow.
It is the absolute darkest hour for humanity. And then suddenly, at the break of dawn, a voice calls out to the besieged, starving camp. The voice simply says, "O people, help has come to you." The narrations include a detail that is so gritty and real. Some of the besieged people hear this voice and remark, "That sounds like the voice of a man who has a full stomach."
That detail is amazing.
They have been starving for so long that they can literally hear the difference in the vocal cords of someone who isn't malnourished. And then the highly anticipated arrival occurs. Jesus, the son of Mary, physically descends from the heavens.
The geographical pinpointing of his descent is fascinating. The texts do not say he descends in Jerusalem or Mecca. They specifically state he descends at the White Minaret on the eastern side of the city of Damascus in Syria, and the visual description of his arrival is striking.
Very detailed.
The narration state he descends resting his hands on the wings of two angels. He's wearing two garments lightly dyed with saffron, but there is a beautiful, deeply humanizing detail included. The texts say his hair looks as though water is actively dripping from it, pearl-like drops, even though his hair is completely dry.
It gives this overwhelming impression of ultimate purity, freshness, and life, which acts as the perfect, stark contrast to the death, decay, and physical deformity surrounding the Dajjal. And what happens immediately after Jesus' feet touch the earth is so politically and theologically poignant. It is the time for the dawn prayer. The commander of the Muslim forces, recognizing Jesus, steps back and respectfully asks Jesus to lead the congregation in prayer. But Jesus declines.
He declines, and the narrations say he places his hand gently on the commander's shoulder or back and says, "No, some of you are leaders over others. This is an honor from God to this nation." This is a massive theological and sociological statement within the text.
How so?
By refusing to lead the prayer, Jesus is showing the ultimate respect to the battered human community that has held the line against the Dajjal.
He is validating their immense suffering and their struggle. He is signaling very clearly that he hasn't returned to abrogate their laws, to bring a new religion, or to install himself as a new authoritarian dictator. He has returned as a supporter, a brother in arms to the righteous who have been bleeding to protect the truth. It is a moment of profound, breathtaking humility that stands in direct, diametric opposition to the Dajjal's arrogant, narcissistic demand to be worshipped.
It is the perfect juxtaposition of leadership. And once the prayer concludes, the momentum shifts entirely. The accounts state that Jesus asks for the gates of the besieged city to be opened. He takes his spear and marches directly toward the Dajjal. Now, the Dajjal has been parading around the globe for a year as an invincible, immortal god. But the texts say that the exact moment the Dajjal lays his functioning eye on Jesus, his entire facade fundamentally crumbles.
The imagery used in the narrations is iconic. It says the Jabi begins to physically dissolve or melt, just as salt melts in water, or in some accounts like lead melting in a
The
fire.
melting is deeply symbolic. It represents the total dissolution of falsehood when forcefully confronted with absolute, unadulterated truth. The deepfakes, the illusions, the manipulated weather, the fake utopias, they all instantly lose their structural integrity. The Dajjal's power only ever existed in the vacuum created by the absence of truth. Once the physical embodiment of the true Messiah arrives, the lie literally cannot maintain its shape. It dissolves.
The Dajjal realizes he is doomed and attempts to flee in absolute terror. But he doesn't get far. The chase ends quickly. Jesus catches up to him at the Gate of Lud, a location in modern-day Palestine near present-day Lud, and Jesus strikes the final decisive blow with his spear, declaring to the Dajjal, "I have a single blow for you that you cannot escape." The ultimate deceiver, the greatest trial in human history, is killed not in a massive cosmic explosion, but with a simple spear thrust.
And with the Dajjal dead, his supernatural grip on the world shatters. The texts describe a massive immediate purge. His vast army of followers panic and scatter, trying to hide. But the environment itself, the very earth they manipulated and abused, turns violently against them. The narrations state that the trees and the stones will literally speak out, miraculously calling to the pursuing believer, saying, "Oh, believer, there is a follower of the Dajjal hiding behind me. Come and deal with him."
Nature itself becomes the intelligence network for the resistance. The only exception the text notes is a specific species of tree called the Garkod tree, which remains entirely silent and hides those behind it, which the text cryptically notes is their tree. It's a surreal, terrifying end to the battle, where the landscape actively participates in expunging the falsehood from the earth.
It signifies the violent restoration of the natural order. The Dajjal's reign was an era where reality was inverted, biology was weaponized, and the environment was hijacked for propaganda. With his defeat, the earth aggressively returns to its proper state, aligning itself unequivocally with the truth.
Which brings us to our final act. We need to explore the bizarre aftermath and the literal end of the world. Because logically, you would think killing the Antichrist is the end of the story, roll credits, humanity wins. But the compilers of these eschatological traditions go so much further, and the timeline accelerates wildly. Initially, following the Dajjal's death, there is a period of absolute unbelievable utopia.
Yes. The accounts describe a 40-year period of unprecedented global peace, justice, and prosperity under the leadership of Jesus. The earth is healed from the droughts and the wars. The agricultural fertility is so extreme that a narration claims a single handful of seeds planted will produce 700 handfuls of grain. Pomegranates will grow so massive that a group of people can sit under the shade of a single peel.
It's almost cartoonishly abundant. But it's not just about giant fruit. It's a fundamental alteration in the violent nature of biological life. The texts say that the venom is removed from all creatures. Lions will guard houses like domestic dogs, wolves will graze peacefully with sheep, and human children will play with venomous snakes without any harm coming to them. It is a literal return to an Edenic state, where the primal hostility between humanity and the natural world is completely erased.
It is the ultimate manifestation of peace. But the eschatological timeline does not allow humanity to remain in this utopia forever. The narrative guides us through a wild, rapid-fire sequence of cataclysmic events that mark the literal unraveling of the physical universe. First, the peace is shattered by the release of Gog and Magog.
Gog and Magog are described not as a deceptive psychological trial like the Dajjal, but as an overwhelming, mindless, destructive force of sheer numbers. The texts describe them swarming out across the earth, sweeping through mountains. They are so incredibly numerous that the vanguard of their army drinks the entire Lake Tiberias, the Sea of Galilee, completely dry, so that when the rear of their army passes by, they say, "There used to be water here."
They cannot be defeated by conventional warfare, or even by the heroic resistance of Jesus and the believers who are forced to hide in the mountains again. Instead, the texts say Gog and Magog are wiped out simultaneously by a divine biological intervention. A microscopic worm called Naph infects their necks, and they all drop dead at the exact same moment.
And then there's the gruesome cleanup. The earth is literally covered in millions of rotting corpses, and the stench is unbearable. God sends massive birds, described as having necks like Bactrian camels, to carry the bodies away and throw them into the sea or into abysses. Then, a torrential, cleansing rain washes the entire surface of the earth until it shines like a mirror.
Following this brief reset, the final, irreversible unraveling begins. The narrations describe a gentle, exceptionally sweet wind that blows across the earth, originating from the south, from the direction of Yemen. But this win has a highly specific, devastating
It
purpose.
takes everyone.
Yes, it
Yeah.
peacefully, painlessly takes the soul of every single human being on earth who has even a mustard seed of faith, morality, or belief in their heart. They all simply breathe it in and quietly pass away.
Leaving the Earth entirely devoid of anyone with a moral compass. And this is where the sociological observation of the classical commentators is at its most brutally pessimistic. Without the presence of faith, without that internal KFR detector, the remaining humans regress entirely and immediately. The social contract completely and violently dissolves.
The accounts are shockingly blunt about the nature of this regression. They explicitly state that the surviving people will mate in the streets like donkeys. There is absolutely no shame, no concept of privacy, no familial bonds, no civilization left. It is a total return to basest animal instincts. The texts even note that the best and most moral person alive during this era will merely be the one who suggests perhaps we should step off the main road behind a wall to do this. That is the absolute peak of their morality.
It is a total, horrifying collapse of human dignity. The texts argue that without spiritual grounding, humanity inevitably and rapidly devolves into its basest biological imperatives. And it is upon this completely degraded animalistic population that the final cosmic apocalyptic events occur.
The physical laws of the universe finally break down. The narrations list them in rapid succession. The sun literally alters its celestial mechanics and rises from the west, closing the door on any further repentance. The mysterious beast of the earth emerges from the ground. There is a deeply symbolic detail where the narrations mention the beast will find Satan crying and prostrating, and it will kill him. And
Wow.
finally, the angel blows the ultimate trumpet, the horn, initiating the destruction of the universe, which falls upon what the texts call the absolute worst generation of creation.
So what does this all mean? We have gone from analyzing highly specific physical flaws, a pigeon-toed walk, and a blind grape-like eye, to deep-fake resurrections, the sociology of marginalized cults, and ultimately the complete cosmic destruction of the universe. When you look at the sheer, overwhelming scale of this narrative, you realize that at its core, these classical eschatological texts are a profound, exhaustive meditation on the fragility of human perception and morality. Whether you approach these narrations literally, as fixed future prophecy, or metaphorically as an enduring guide to human nature, the Dayal represents something terrifyingly real. He is the physical embodiment of the eternal human struggle against seductive misinformation. He is the desire to follow whoever promises us easy, immediate material solutions, and the terrifying reality of how our deepest griefs and desires can be weaponized against us.
And if we look back at the entire trajectory of what we discussed today, there's a chilling final thought to consider, particularly regarding the very end of the Dajal's reign. We discussed how, when Jesus defeats him, the earth itself turns against the tyrant's followers. The trees and the stones speak out, actively exposing the deception. Except for one.
The Garkad tree.
Yes. The narrations explicitly point out that the Garkad tree remains completely stubbornly silent. It hides the followers of falsehood. It offers them shade and protection while the rest of the world is screaming the truth.
The silent tree. It just sits there watching it happen.
Exactly. We spend so much time analyzing the active deceiver, the Dajjal, with his magic, his illusions, and his armies. We worry about how to spot the tyrant. But the inclusion of the Garkad tree introduces a far more insidious concept. It represents the complicity of the environment. It represents the institutions, the platforms, or the bystanders that don't actively tell lies, but choose to remain perfectly silent and provide cover for those who do. As you navigate the complexities of our modern world, the text suggests that the ultimate danger might not just be the charismatic leader with the obvious physical flaws. The ultimate danger might be the terrifying silence of the Garkad trees around you. The realization that when society falls to ultimate deception, even the landscape you trusted can become complicit in your destruction.
The terrifying silence of the bystanders. That is a deeply unsettling thought to leave on. Thank you for joining us on this exhaustive deep dive into the eschatological source material. We'll see you next time.